Marin Calloway watched a wealthy rancher drive 37 unfamiliar heifers into her grazing herd, then calmly announced that every one of them belonged to him. Standing beside the fence, Grant Mercer smiled as if the argument had already been won. His workers insisted the cattle had wandered across the property line, while his lawyer warned Marin that she had no way to prove otherwise. Even neighboring ranchers quietly advised her to give up before the dispute became expensive. But Marin noticed one detail no one else had bothered to examine. Days later, a routine brand inspection uncovered something so damaging that Grant's entire ownership claim began collapsing before anyone reached a courtroom. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what would you do if a wealthy neighbor deliberately mixed his cattle into your herd and then tried to claim your best animals? Marin Calloway slowed her pickup the moment she spotted unfamiliar cattle grazing among her herd. She counted once, then again. 37 heifers. None of them belonged on her ranch. She climbed over the fence and walked toward the herd, keeping her movements calm so she wouldn't startle the animals. Her own cows barely reacted, but the newcomers stayed unusually close together, almost as if they had been driven into the pasture only hours earlier. Her ranch manager, Ben Ortiz, hurried across the grass. "I've never seen those heifers before." Marin nodded. "Neither have I." She scanned the fence line. About 50 yards away, one steel gate stood slightly open. Not broken. Not damaged. Unlocked and opened deliberately. Ben frowned. "I locked that gate yesterday." Before Marin could answer, the rumble of diesel engines echoed across the pasture. 3 pickups rolled through the neighboring entrance. Grant Mercer climbed out first, wearing expensive boots, pressed jeans, and the confident smile of a man who believed every conversation would end in his favor. Behind him came 2 ranch hands and a lawyer carrying a leather folder. Grant looked across the mixed herd and shrugged. "Looks like your cows invited some guests." Marin folded her arms. "Your cattle crossed onto my property." Grant smiled wider. "Actually, I think your herd became mixed with mine." Ben stepped forward. "That's ridiculous. The animals are standing on Marin's land." Grant ignored him. "My foreman counted 37 missing heifers this morning." He pointed toward the unfamiliar animals. "There they are." Marin looked directly at him. "If they're yours, why did they come through my gate?" Grant glanced toward the fence. "Livestock don't care about property lines." "My lawyer does." The lawyer opened his folder. "We're prepared to begin a formal ownership claim immediately." Ben whispered, "This was planned." Marin already knew. Nothing about the scene felt accidental. The matching age of the heifers, their nearly identical condition, the open gate, and the timing. Someone had intended for those cattle to disappear into her herd. Grant walked slowly along the fence. "You know how these things usually end. Mixed cattle create confusion. Confusion creates mistakes, and mistakes become expensive." He looked toward his lawyer. "We'll need access to inspect every animal." Ben immediately objected. "Not without permission." Grant smiled. "I think you'll want this settled quickly." "So do I," Marin replied. She pulled out her phone and began photographing every section of the pasture, the open gate, tire impressions near the entrance, and each unfamiliar heifer she could identify. Grant laughed. "Pictures won't change ownership." "They might not," Marin said quietly, "but they'll preserve what was here today." For a brief moment, Grant's smile faded. Only for a second. Then he climbed onto the fence rail and looked over the herd. He raised one arm. His foreman stepped forward and pointed, not at the 37 unfamiliar heifers, but at several of Marin's finest breeding cows. "Those belonged to Mercer Ranch, too." The pasture fell silent. Even the wind seemed to disappear as Grant's foreman pointed toward the valuable females. Ben let out a short laugh. "You've got to be kidding." Grant didn't smile. "I've spent 25 years building my herd. I know my cattle." Marin looked across the pasture at the cows his foreman had identified. Every one of them had been born or raised on her ranch. Some had produced calves for nearly a decade. She calmly asked, "Would you like to tell me their names?" Grant frowned. "Their names? Yes. You seem confident they're yours. What do you call them? Grant hesitated. We don't name commercial cattle. Marin nodded. I do. She pointed toward a deep red cow grazing near the creek. That's Ruby. Then another. That's June. She indicated a black cow with a white blaze. And that's Hazel. Without raising her voice, she continued naming each animal the foreman had claimed. Ben watched Grant carefully. For the first time, the wealthy rancher didn't appear completely comfortable. Grant's lawyer stepped forward. Names don't establish ownership. No, Marin replied. They don't. But people usually recognize the animals they've raised. The lawyer ignored the remark and opened another folder. We've prepared an inventory of every heifer reported missing this morning. He handed several pages to Marin. She studied the list. 37 missing heifers appeared at the top, but beneath them were 15 additional cattle. They were not heifers and had not been reported missing that morning. They were mature breeding cows, including the same cows Grant's foreman had just identified. Marin slowly looked up. This list wasn't written today. Grant crossed his arms. What makes you think that? She held up the paperwork. Because these cows have been on my vaccination and breeding schedules for years. You couldn't have identified them after arriving this morning. Grant answered without hesitation. We've been looking for them. Ben frowned. Looking for cattle you never reported lost or stolen. Grant didn't respond. After the Mercer trucks pulled away, Ben stood beside the open gate. This was never only about 37 heifers. Marin nodded. No. He's using those heifers to create confusion. She unfolded the inventory again. The real target was always these 15. Ben looked toward the pasture. Why them? Marin watched the breeding group grazing together. Because they're among the most valuable females on this ranch. They produce our best calves, and they're worth far more than the 37 strangers. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Marin noticed something else. Every mature cow on Grant's list shared one thing in common. Each had grazed in the western pasture during the previous month, the only pasture directly bordering Mercer Ranch. She quietly folded the papers. This wasn't a random dispute. He didn't choose those cows today. He's been studying them for weeks. Marin didn't drive back to the house immediately. She remained beside the fence, watching her cattle settle after the commotion. Grant hadn't come only to recover 37 heifers. Those animals were the excuse. His real target had always been the 15 proven breeding cows. Ben folded the paperwork and shook his head. Nobody guesses the exact cows by accident. Marin agreed. He already knew which ones he wanted, and he knew exactly where they would be. Back at the ranch office, Marin unlocked an old steel filing cabinet that had belonged to her father. Unlike ranchers who had switched entirely to computers, she kept both digital copies and handwritten livestock records. Every calf born on the ranch had its own page: birth date, dam, sire, vaccinations, weight records, breeding history, and unusual markings. Ben pulled out one binder after another. I forgot how much you recorded. My dad always said memories fade. Ink doesn't. For nearly 2 hours, they compared Grant's claim with Marin's files. One by one, every mature cow on his list matched years of documentation: Ruby, Hazel, June, Willow, Fern. Each file contained photographs from branding days, veterinary certificates, vaccination records, and breeding notes dating back several seasons. Ben smiled. This should end the argument. Marin didn't answer. She had already noticed something that troubled her. She spread the files across the wooden table and counted. 15 claimed cows. 15 complete histories. But only 8 files contained recent photographs showing a clearly visible brand after the animal reached adulthood. The remaining 7 had complete medical and breeding histories, yet none showed a recent readable photograph of the brand. Ben looked confused. How did that happen? Marin leaned back. Those 7 were photographed when they were calves. After that, we never had a reason to take another close picture of the brand. The records proved the cows belonged to her, but the most immediate visual evidence was weaker than she wanted. The following morning, Grant's lawyer arrived with a formal notice requesting that every disputed animal remain in place and proposing temporary possession by a neutral holding facility until ownership could be determined. Ben read the document twice. They're trying to move the cattle. Marin nodded. If those cows leave this ranch, the confusion only gets worse. She looked at the 7 files again. Everything else was solid. Veterinary visits, calving histories, feed records, pregnancy examinations, and years of documentation. Only one thing was missing, a clear and recent image of each brand. Grant had somehow selected exactly the 7 animals whose marks were hardest to read beneath age and summer hair. Ben slowly lowered the paperwork. You think he knew? Marin closed the final binder. I don't think. I know, because no one could have selected those same 7 unless they had examined the animals before this started. The notice remained on Marin's desk overnight. By sunrise, nearly every rancher in the county had heard about the dispute. Some believed Grant. Others quietly believed Marin. Most stayed out of it. Nobody wanted to become involved in a fight between one of the county's wealthiest ranchers and a woman running a mid-sized cattle operation. Ben entered the office carrying 2 coffee mugs. I've had 3 people call already. What did they want? They weren't asking what happened. They were asking who they should believe. Marin gave a faint smile. That tells me everything. Instead of arguing with rumors, she drove to the western pasture to inspect the 7 cows herself. One by one, she guided them through the working chute. Each remained calm. These weren't frightened or unfamiliar cattle. They were cows she had handled for years. She brushed loose hair away from the first branding scar. The mark looked older than Grant claimed, but time had blurred its edges. The second looked similar. The third carried an even fainter impression beneath thick summer hair. Ben examined it. I can barely make it out. So can everyone else, Marin replied. That's exactly what Grant is counting on. While the cattle waited in the holding pen, Marin compared their brands with sketches in her father's old notebook. Years before smartphones and digital photographs, her father had drawn every branding iron by hand. Each sketch recorded tiny differences in angle, spacing, and curve. He believed no 2 ranch brands were ever truly identical. Ben looked over her shoulder. Your father's drawing looks sharper than the marks on the cows. It should. Brands soften as the animals grow in age. She paused. But their basic proportions don't change. Late that afternoon, an elderly rancher named Walter Briggs pulled into the yard. Walter had retired after breeding cattle across 3 neighboring counties. He removed his hat and asked, I heard you're fighting over brands. Marin nodded. Walter spent several minutes studying one of the mature cows. Then he surprised everyone. I'm not interested only in what was burned into her hide. He ran his hand gently along the animal's shoulder. I'm interested in where it was burned. Ben frowned. What difference does that make? Walter smiled. A careful rancher places a brand in nearly the same spot every time. A person trying to modify or imitate something doesn't always have that luxury. Marin stared at the faded mark again. For the first time, she wasn't looking only at the shape. She was looking at its position, angle, and distance from the shoulder blade. Then she whispered, I think Grant made one mistake, and it may be hiding in plain sight. Walter remained beside the holding pen, his weathered hand resting against the nearest cow. He wasn't studying only the symbol anymore. He was studying the shoulder beneath it. After 50 years around cattle, he had learned something younger ranchers rarely considered. A branding iron leaves more than a mark, he said. It leaves a habit. Ben looked puzzled. What do you mean? Walter pointed to the upper shoulder. Every ranch develops its own routine. Same side. Same height. Same angle. After you've branded thousands of cattle, you stop thinking about it. Marin nodded. Her father had always positioned the Callaway brand slightly above the main shoulder muscle, never lower and never close to the neck. The 7 mature breeding cows matched that general placement despite their faded marks. She then asked Ben to guide several of the unfamiliar heifers through the chute. When the hair was parted, a different pattern appeared. On the 37 newcomers, the darker and apparently newer portions of the brands sat almost 2 inches lower and leaned at a slightly different angle from the older underlying scars. The difference was subtle but remarkably consistent. Ben stared at the animals. I never noticed. Neither did I, Marin admitted, because I was looking at the finished symbol, not how someone had created it. That afternoon, Marin drove to the county livestock office. She wasn't there to accuse Grant. She wanted information. An experienced clerk named Denise Holloway welcomed her. What can I help you with? Marin placed several photographs on the counter. Do ranchers register where they place their brands? Denise smiled. No. The state records the design, not the location. Marin felt a wave of disappointment. So placement doesn't matter legally? Denise leaned forward. Not by itself, but experienced inspectors notice it. Every ranch develops a pattern, and it is surprisingly difficult to change years of muscle memory. Placement can support other physical and documentary evidence. Those words stayed with Marin all the way back to her truck. The following morning, a certified letter arrived from Grant's attorney. This time, it wasn't another ownership notice. It was an offer. Grant would withdraw his claim to the 15 breeding cows if Marin handed over the 37 heifers without involving the state livestock inspector. Ben read the letter twice. Yesterday, he wanted everything. Today, he's willing to settle. Marin folded the paper. People don't compromise this quickly unless they're afraid of what comes next. She looked toward the pens where the disputed animals waited. Grant wasn't trying to win everything anymore. He was trying to stop someone from looking too closely. Late that afternoon, Marin called the State Livestock Inspection Division. When the dispatcher answered, she spoke one sentence. I'd like to request a full ownership and brand inspection. After a brief silence, the dispatcher asked, is this connected to a disputed herd? Marin looked across the pasture toward Mercer Ranch. Yes, and I believe someone may have altered more than the paperwork. The call changed everything. Within an hour, Marin received confirmation that a certified brand inspector would arrive in 2 days. She told almost no one. Only Ben and Walter. The fewer people who knew, the better. Grant had already shown how much he valued controlling information. The next morning, Ben discovered fresh tire tracks near the eastern entrance. They weren't here last night. Marin studied the ground. A dual-wheel pickup had entered with a gooseneck livestock trailer. The tracks ended beside the holding pens, turned around and returned to the road. No cattle had been loaded. Ben frowned. They were checking. Checking what? Marin looked toward the highway. Whether the cattle were still here. By lunchtime, Grant's black pickup rolled into the ranch. He climbed out as confidently as ever, although this time he wasn't smiling quite as much. I heard you called the state. Marin didn't deny it. I did. Grant slipped both hands into his pockets. That's unnecessary. I've already offered a fair settlement. You keep your best cows, I take my 37 heifers, and we both move on. Marin looked directly at him. If the heifers are yours and nothing was altered, you shouldn't be worried about an inspection. For the first time since the dispute began, Grant didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the holding pens. State inspections take time. They stress cattle. They cost money and create problems nobody wants. Marin remained calm. They also answer questions. Grant's jaw tightened. Late that afternoon, Ben drove toward the county feed store. Halfway there, he noticed 2 empty livestock trailers parked beside a vacant lot outside town. Both belonged to Mercer Ranch, and both loading gates were open. Ben continued to the feed store. Inside, an older truck driver recognized him. You work with Marin? Ben nodded. The driver lowered his voice. Mercer's crew has been asking whether state inspectors are coming. Who told you that? They've been asking everybody. Back at the ranch, Marin gathered every disputed animal into the main corrals before sunset. She checked every latch, locked every gate, photographed the cattle again, and installed temporary chain locks on both loading entrances. Walter watched quietly. You think he'll try tonight? Marin didn't answer. She looked toward Mercer Ranch, where lights remained on inside Grant's equipment barn much later than usual. Just before dark, her phone rang. It was the state livestock inspector. "I'm leaving earlier than scheduled," he said. "I've handled enough ownership disputes to know that when someone objects this strongly to an inspection, they're often afraid of what it will find." The inspector arrived just after sunrise. A white pickup carrying the state seal rolled through Marin's gate. Instead of unloading equipment immediately, the inspector stood beside the pens and watched the cattle for nearly a minute. He introduced himself as Daniel Pierce. Marin shook his hand. "Thank you for coming." Daniel nodded. "I'd rather inspect cattle than settle arguments." Grant arrived less than 15 minutes later with his attorney, foreman, and 2 ranch hands. He forced a polite smile. "I hope we can clear this up quickly." Daniel looked at both ranchers. "That's why I'm here." Everyone expected him to begin by examining the brands. Instead, he asked a question that surprised both sides. "Who sorted these cattle into this pen?" Ben answered, "We did." Daniel looked at Marin. "Has anyone moved them since yesterday afternoon?" "No." Daniel nodded and wrote something in his notebook. Grant exchanged a glance with his lawyer. Neither understood why the question mattered. Neither did Marin. Daniel entered the pen alone. He carried no branding irons or chemicals, only a notebook, flashlight, clippers, gloves, and a small ruler. He walked around the first heifer, then the second and third. He barely appeared to study the finished brand. Instead, he examined the direction of the hair, the texture of the scar tissue, and the condition of the surrounding hide. Grant finally broke the silence. "I thought you were here to inspect ownership." Daniel didn't look up. "I am." "Then why aren't you checking the brand?" Daniel replied, "I am, just not the way you expected." Nearly an hour passed before Daniel spoke again. He pointed toward one unfamiliar heifer. "This animal interests me." Grant stepped forward. "That's one of mine." Daniel raised a hand. "Please don't answer until I finish." He parted the hair around the brand and measured the distance between the shoulder blade and the center of the mark. Then he repeated the process on another heifer and another. Every measurement went into his notebook. Ben whispered, "What is he measuring?" Walter smiled faintly. "I think he's measuring habit." Daniel eventually stood and walked toward Grant. "Mercer, when were these heifers originally branded?" Grant answered without hesitation. "About 4 years ago, before I purchased them." Daniel nodded. "So, to your knowledge, none of the marks have been touched since then?" "Of course not." Daniel closed his notebook and looked directly into Grant's eyes. "Then perhaps you can explain why the hair and scar tissue crossing parts of these brands are less than a year old." Grant didn't answer immediately. For the first time, confidence disappeared from his face. His attorney stepped forward. "My client isn't a veterinarian. He can't be expected to know how hair grows after branding." Daniel calmly closed the notebook. "I wasn't asking him to explain biology. I was asking him to confirm the timeline." The pasture became silent. Even Grant's ranch hands stopped whispering. Daniel motioned for everyone to gather around the first heifer. He clipped a small patch of hair surrounding the mark, making the scar easier to see. He pointed toward the outer edge. "A proper brand heals from the outside inward." His gloved finger traced the scar tissue. "This portion healed years ago." Then he indicated several darker lines crossing the original mark. "These sections didn't." Grant folded his arms tighter. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Daniel looked at him. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm documenting what the animal shows." He moved to the second heifer, then the third and fourth. Every animal he examined showed the same pattern. The original scars were old, but selected portions had been burned again. Not enough to erase the first brand, only enough to reshape it. Ben stared at the cattle. "Somebody didn't replace the original marks. They modified them." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. Only the lines necessary to make the original symbol resemble another registered brand." A murmur spread among the ranchers outside the pen. One cattleman shook his head. "I've never seen anyone attempt that." Another replied, I have. It rarely ends well. Grant glanced toward the crowd. For the first time, people weren't studying Marin. They were watching him. Grant finally spoke. Are you saying someone changed my brand? Daniel remained calm. I'm saying someone applied fresh heat over an older scar. Who did it? I don't know yet. When? I can provide a reasonable range based on the healing. Daniel looked toward the cattle. Less than 12 months ago. Grant's attorney interrupted. That's speculation. Daniel returned to his truck and brought back a laminated training guide used by state inspectors. It contained photographs of branding scars at different stages: fresh, 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. He placed the guide beside the photographs taken that morning. You don't have to accept my conclusion without support. Compare them. Several ranchers leaned forward. Walter adjusted his glasses. Ben compared each image. Nobody argued. The scar tissue around the altered sections closely matched the newer examples. Walter broke the silence. I saw something like this 40 years ago. A rancher tried to turn 3 characters into 2. He fooled nearly everyone until an inspector examined the healing pattern. Another rancher muttered, I remember hearing about that case. They lost everything. Grant looked away. Daniel then moved toward the mature breeding cows Grant had claimed. He examined Ruby, Hazel, June, Fern, and the others, measuring the location and angle of every mark. Marin waited without speaking. Finally, Daniel stood. There it is. What did you find? She asked. He opened his notebook. The darker, recently altered portions on the 37 heifers share a consistent lower placement and angle. The old Callaway brands on these breeding cows don't. Their placement matches Marin's historical records and the other mature cows born on this ranch. Grant shrugged. So, what? Daniel closed the notebook. It means whoever modified the heifers used a different branding habit from the ranch that raised these breeding cows. Placement alone doesn't decide ownership, but habits become powerful when they support the scar evidence and records. He looked into Grant's eyes. Habits are much harder to fake than a symbol. This time, Grant didn't answer, and neither did anyone standing behind him. Grant forced a short laugh. So now we're talking about habits instead of ownership? Daniel didn't react. In livestock investigations, habits often reveal the truth before people do. He slipped his notebook into his vest. I've finished examining the cattle. Grant spread his hands. Then we're done. Daniel shook his head. No. We're only finished with the animals. Now I'd like to examine the paperwork. Grant's attorney glanced toward him. For the first time that morning, he didn't look nearly as confident. Everyone moved into Marin's machine shed, where folding tables became a temporary inspection station. Daniel organized the documents into stacks: purchase records, transportation permits, veterinary certificates, holding yard reports, and ranch intake forms. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Grant leaned against the wall. I brought everything you requested. Daniel nodded. I appreciate that. Ben whispered to Marin, he still thinks he's going to win. She replied quietly, or he thinks nobody will notice what he's hiding. Daniel opened the purchase file. Every page looked complete, with signatures, auction numbers, sale dates, and vaccination records. Grant folded his arms. You'll find everything in order. Daniel didn't look up. I'm sure I'll find something. He examined every page carefully, moving almost painfully slowly. The room grew quieter with every minute. Even Grant's ranch hands stopped talking. One glanced toward his boss, waiting for reassurance, but Grant avoided eye contact. Nearly 20 minutes later, Daniel stopped. His finger rested on a transportation permit. Who hauled these 37 heifers? Grant answered immediately. My shipping company. Daniel turned another page. The permit lists Prairie Ridge Livestock Transport. Correct. You own that company? My brother-in-law operates it. Daniel nodded. And where were the cattle delivered after purchase? Grant pointed toward the paperwork. My ranch. Daniel rotated the permit so everyone could read it. No, their first destination was North Valley Holding Facility. Ben frowned. That's not Mercer Ranch. Grant answered quickly. They stayed there overnight. Daniel turned the next page. No, they remained there for 17 days. The silence changed. 17 days was unusually long for healthy cattle waiting to move only a short distance. Grant's attorney stepped in. There were transportation delays. Daniel nodded. Possibly. He continued reading. During those 17 days, the heifers were examined, vaccinated, reweighed, and moved between pens. Every procedure had been documented. Walter crossed his arms. That's an expensive place to keep healthy cattle. No one disagreed. Daniel reached for another document that hadn't come from Grant. I requested this directly from the transportation registry. He placed it beside the holding yard records. Grant's confident expression began to disappear. Daniel pointed to the dates. The heifers arrived at Mercer Ranch only 4 days before they appeared inside Marin's herd. Nobody spoke. Daniel continued. So you legally purchased 37 heifers. They spent more than 2 weeks at a holding facility, arrived at your ranch, and within 4 days somehow crossed a boundary gate, mixed perfectly into Marin's herd, and became the basis for paperwork claiming 15 of her most valuable breeding cows. Ben looked toward Grant. That's one incredible coincidence. Grant opened his mouth, but Daniel removed another page. I made one call during lunch. It wasn't to the holding facility. It was to the company that performed the mandatory brand inspection before these heifers were transported. For the first time since the dispute began, Grant lowered his eyes. No one spoke as Daniel laid the certified pre-shipment inspection on the table. The room had been noisy all morning. Now it was completely silent. Grant's attorney reached for the document. What exactly is this? Daniel answered calmly. A certified copy of the brand inspection completed before these 37 heifers entered North Valley Holding Facility. Grant forced a smile. What does that prove? Daniel placed another folder beside it. This contains the photographs taken during that inspection. He spread large color prints across the table. Every heifer had been photographed individually, including the left shoulder and original brand. Everything had been documented before transportation. Ben leaned forward and his eyes widened. Those aren't the same. Grant shook his head. Cattle grow. Brands change. Daniel placed one pre-shipment photograph beside an image taken that morning. The animals grew. The basic brands didn't change naturally. He pointed carefully. This corner was open. Now it's closed. This line ended here. Now it continues. This curve became an angle. The differences were small, almost invisible, but once Daniel traced them, nobody could unsee them. Walter whispered, they didn't replace the brand. They finished it. Daniel nodded. They burned only the sections needed to make the old symbol resemble a different registered mark. Several ranchers exchanged uneasy looks. One of Grant's ranch hands stepped backward. Grant's attorney tried again. Someone could have altered the marks after my client purchased the cattle, but without his knowledge. Daniel looked at him. That's a fair question. Let's examine the timeline. He opened another report. The 17 days at North Valley included daily health observations. No fresh burns were reported, and no heifer received treatment for branding wounds while at the facility. Daniel turned to the Mercer Ranch intake and treatment records. 4 days after arrival, 6 heifers received topical medication for fresh shoulder burns. The treatment dates matched the estimated age of the newer scar tissue. Ben looked at Grant. You knew. Grant's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. For the first time, his voice no longer sounded confident. Daniel reached beneath the reports. There's one more piece. He placed a large photograph on the table. It didn't show cattle. It showed a portable branding furnace beside the holding pens at Mercer Ranch. The photograph had been taken by a feed delivery driver the morning after the heifers arrived. Painted on the steel frame was an equipment number, Merker Ranch Equipment 12. Walter recognized it. That's Grant's portable branding rig. Daniel nodded and placed the supporting equipment log beside the photograph. It was checked out from the Mercer equipment barn the morning after the heifers arrived and returned the following evening. That period overlaps the treatment records for fresh shoulder burns. Grant's attorney stopped writing. His pen remained suspended above the page before he slowly closed his notebook. Grant stared at the photograph. For the first time since stepping onto Marin's ranch, he had no explanation, excuse, or argument. Daniel gathered the records into one stack and looked directly at him. The evidence indicates that 37 heifers were introduced into another rancher's herd after selected portions of their brands had been altered. While everyone argued over those animals, you presented a prepared claim naming 15 of Marin Calloway's highest value breeding cows. Nobody moved. Sheriff Nolan Hayes, who had been observing from the doorway after Daniel requested law enforcement presence, stepped across the concrete floor. He stopped beside Grant. "Mr. Mercer, based on the inspector's findings and the evidence presented, I need you to remain here while we determine the next steps." Grant looked around the room. The ranch hands who had always stood behind him avoided his eyes. Even his attorney said nothing. In that moment, Grant realized he hadn't lost because Marin argued better. He had lost because the truth had been documented long before he tried to rewrite it. Sheriff Hayes's words settled over the room like a heavy storm. Nobody connected to these cattle is leaving until statements have been taken and the evidence has been secured. Grant looked toward his attorney. For the first time since the dispute began, neither man spoke. The attorney closed his briefcase. "We'd like a few minutes to speak privately." Sheriff Hayes nodded. "You may confer, but nobody leaves the property." Grant and his attorney stepped outside. Through the office window, Marin watched them arguing beside the black pickup. Grant waved his arms. His attorney remained calm. After several minutes, both men returned. Grant's expression had changed. The confidence and arrogance were gone. He looked tired. His attorney cleared his throat. "My client would like to resolve the civil ownership dispute." Daniel looked up from his reports. "Go on." Grant spoke. "The claim to the 15 breeding cows will be withdrawn. The 37 heifers may remain under state supervision until their lawful brands and ownership records are corrected. Mercer Ranch will pay for the veterinary examinations related to this dispute." Ben stared at him. "That's it?" Grant looked toward Marin. "You keep your cows. I cover the expenses and the private claims end." His attorney continued. "My client is also prepared to repair the gate and fencing, cover Marin's reasonable legal expenses, and compensate her for documented disruption." Walter shook his head. "That's a generous civil offer. What does he want in return?" The attorney answered carefully. "A release of private claims and confidentiality concerning the settlement." Sheriff Hayes interrupted before anyone could misunderstand. "A private settlement cannot stop a state investigation into brand alteration, trespass, attempted livestock theft, or falsified records. Those decisions do not belong solely to either ranch owner." The room became silent again. Grant wasn't trying to escape every investigation through a contract anymore. He was trying to limit the civil damage and save what remained of his reputation. Grant turned toward Marin. "I made mistakes. I'm willing to fix them. There doesn't have to be a public lawsuit between our ranches." Marin looked at him for several seconds. She remembered every threat and every moment he assumed a smaller operation would surrender. "If this had worked, how many cows would you have taken?" Grant didn't answer. "And after mine, whose ranch would have been next?" Silence. The answer was visible on his face. Marin walked toward the office window overlooking the pasture. Her cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that weeks of uncertainty were ending. Daniel stepped beside her. "You control your civil claims. The state will decide how the evidence is handled." Marin looked back at Grant. "Then I'm not signing a confidentiality agreement, and I'm not releasing my claims before the investigation is complete." She turned toward Sheriff Hayes. I want every document, shipment, disputed brand, and prior ownership claim examined. If this happened here, I need to know it won't happen to another ranch family." Sheriff Hayes nodded. "The investigation will follow the evidence." Grant lowered his head. He finally understood that losing control of 37 heifers was no longer his greatest problem. The investigation was no longer about one herd. It had become about every questionable brand and ownership claim connected to the Mercer name. The inquiry continued long after the immediate dispute ended. Unlike the rumors that had spread through the county in a single afternoon, the truth moved slowly. Investigators examined every shipment, purchase, brand record, treatment entry, and transportation permit one by one. Marin returned to her normal routine: morning feedings, fence repairs, checking water tanks, and moving cattle between pastures. She refused to spend every day wondering what would happen to Grant. That decision no longer belonged to her. 3 weeks later, Sheriff Hayes returned carrying a single envelope. Marin met him outside the barn. "I thought you'd want to hear the preliminary findings from me." She opened the envelope. The investigation had confirmed that multiple heifers under Mercer's control carried altered brands applied after their original inspections. Grant's claim to Marin's breeding cows had been formally withdrawn. Several older ownership disputes involving other ranches were reopened for review. Mercer Ranch was temporarily prohibited from transferring disputed livestock until the state verified every pending ownership record. Marin closed the report. She didn't smile. She simply nodded. The truth finally caught up. A week later, something unexpected happened. Neighboring ranchers began calling Marin, not to congratulate her, but to ask for help. One admitted, "I've never kept proper records." Another said, "My father handled all of that. I don't even know where half our branding paperwork is." Marin realized that Grant's scheme had depended partly on honest ranchers trusting memory more than documentation. That was a mistake nobody wanted to repeat. The following Saturday, she opened her equipment shed to anyone who wanted to attend. There was no admission fee and no speech. Only folding tables, coffee cameras, and stacks of blank livestock record books. Daniel attended, as did Walter and several local veterinarians. Together, they showed ranch families how to photograph brands correctly, record placement and unusual markings, organize breeding histories, store veterinary certificates, and document every transfer before confusion could begin. By sunset, dozens of ranchers left carrying organized files instead of loose papers. Walter watched them drive away. "Funny thing about a brand." Marin looked at him. "What's that?" "It tells people who claims the animal." He paused. "Good records tell the truth, even when someone tries to change the brand." Several months later, Marin stood beside the pasture where the dispute had begun. Her herd moved peacefully through fresh grass. No strangers. No confusion. Only cattle that belonged exactly where they were. Ben approached carrying a newspaper. Grant had quietly sold a large portion of his operation while the remaining legal and administrative proceedings continued. The article barely mentioned the investigation. It didn't need to. Around the county, people already knew the story, not only because a wealthy rancher had been held accountable, but because one woman refused to surrender when staying silent would have been easier. Marin watched her herd disappear over the hill. Grant Mercer believed ownership could be manufactured with a branding iron and enough confusion. Marin proved that a mark burned into hide could be altered, but honesty leaves a record no fire can erase. If Marin's story reminded you that careful records can protect everything you've worked to build, tell us in the comments what you would have done after finding 37 unfamiliar heifers inside your herd. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about hardworking ranchers, hidden evidence, and ordinary people who refuse to surrender the truth.